Hi, folks, and welcome to the podcast, News from the Rebellion. My name's Rob, and I'm the host. I'm a school teacher by trade. I've been working in education for 30 years or more now, mostly supporting educational software. Now, as I'm getting older, I've developed an interest in the Civil War, and I spend a lot of my time reading newspapers from the 1860s. As I was reading, I began to wonder what it was like back then, learning about what was going on in the world through the local newspaper. During the Civil War, the newspaper was pretty much the only way most people had to figure out what was going on. Then I began to wonder how newspapers from different parts of the country told the story. This led to other questions, like what is the role of the newspaper? How does the newspaper influence what people believe? And how does what people believe influence the newspapers? Well, that's the premise of this podcast. I'll follow events that led up to and were part of the American Civil War and provide readings of newspapers from the South and the North. If you are looking for a podcast with a lot of interesting discussion and interesting guests, well, sorry about that, but this is not that kind of podcast. Think of it more as an old-time newsreel, like in the 40s, or a radio show that you tune into to hear the latest news. Kind of old school, I know, but let your imagination take you back in time. Okay, let's go now to the year 1839, where the Nat Turner insurrection was in the headlines.
The Richmond Inquirer, Richmond, Virginia, November 4th, 1831. Richmond, Virginia, Friday, November 4th, latest news. General Nat Turner apprehended. There's no doubt that Nat Turner is caught at last on the very scene of his atrocities. Rumor says that he displayed no sort of enterprise in the attempt to escape, nor any degree of courage in resisting the person who captured him. Private letters informed that he had been taken and committed to the jail of Southampton. The official account confirms the intelligence. We are indebted to the governor for a copy of the following letter. Sussex, 31st October, 1831. Sir R., perhaps this will reach you before any other intelligence of the capture of General Nat Turner, and as you have had so many accounts of his being taken in different places, you may yet be disposed to doubt. Nevertheless, he was taken yesterday by Benjamin Phipps in the county of Southampton in a cave, within a few miles of where the principal part of the depredations were committed, and was this day seen by Mr. Little on Barker in confinement and in the presence, as Barker supposed, of nearly 100 persons who had collected for the purpose of gratifying their curiosity. I forbear to say more, as the whole of the particulars will reach you in a few days. I am, sir, respectfully yours, General John Floyd, Governor, Richmond, Virginia. We shall attempt to obtain as accurate an account as possible of the conduct of this murderous bandit. We shall place it upon record, in order that if any future historian should hereafter paint him incorrectly, as the Albany fabulist has done the insurgent Gabriel, the facts may be ready to refute his falsehoods.
Petersburg Intelligencer. Petersburg, Virginia, August 26, 1831. The Insurrections. A great excitement has prevailed in this town for some days past, in consequence of the receipt of information on Monday night last that an insurrection had broken out among the Negroes in Southampton. The rumors have been so numerous and contradictory that we are unable to state to our readers at present the precise state of affairs in that county. It appears, however, that the disturbance commenced on Sunday night last, in the neighborhood of the Cross Keys, about 10 miles from the courthouse, and has been almost entirely confined to that section of the county. The number of insurgents has been variously estimated from 150 to 400, acting in detached parties. From 25 to 30 families are said to have fallen victim to their ferocity. We are happy to say that the latest intelligence from the scene of the disorder assures us that the further progress of these wretches has been arrested, that they are seeking shelter in the swamps, and that they are by this time surrounded by the militia and volunteers. The letter, which we give below, written by a highly intelligent and respectable gentleman of this town, is the latest account received here and relieves us from the necessity of detailing the various rumors in circulation. Our friends at a distance may rest assured that we are prepared to meet any emergency. The governor and council have taken prompt and efficient measures to put a speedy end to the disturbance. A finely equipped troop of horse, commanded by Captain Harrison, and a troop of horse from Prince George, left this place on Wednesday last for Southampton. We understand that a company of artillery went down in the steamboat from Richmond on Tuesday, and that detachments of the militia of surrounding counties have already taken up the line of march. We have not yet been able to send any assistance to our unfortunate neighbors, not having had arms more than sufficient to supply our own wants. The arms ordered by the executive did not arrive until Wednesday night. We are therefore now prepared to act when and where occasion may require. We trust, however, from the force already on the scene of action that by this time, tranquility has been restored. Belfield, Greenville County, August 24, 1831. In the greatest haste, I write you a few lines. I can merely say that we are all in arms and in great excitement on account of the insurrection, which broke out on Sunday night last. Between 80 and 100 of the whites have already been butchered, their heads severed from their bodies. The intention of the Negroes was to reach the dismal swamp. I think, however, that we have them so hemmed in as to render it impossible for them to do so. On Monday night I reached Belfield, headquarters of the troops, and was given the command of a small body and a piece of artillery, which I stationed so as to command the bridge. I was up the whole night visiting each of my sentinels every 10 minutes. At Jerusalem, the blacks made 3 desperate attempts to cross the bridge but were repulsed with some loss. No whites have been lost in any of the skirmishes which have taken place. Those fellows commenced by murdering a family, taking their arms and horses, and pushing on to the next house with all possible speed, where they massacred every white, even to the infant in the cradle. They continue in this manner until they are interrupted, when they disperse and skulk about in the woods, until another favorable opportunity occurs of collecting together and repeating their horrible massacres. Between 25 and 30 families have already been entirely destroyed. 3 families were yesterday murdered, one consisting of 10 persons. Something will be effected today, as very active officers and well-armed men are at the heels of these villains. Yesterday a very spirited resistance was made by a party, sent out to reconnoiter and discover the position of these fellows, consisting of 4 against 20 blacks. The whites repulsed them, killed 3 or 4, and took several prisoners. Many of the blacks are well mounted. Their leader was shot in the attempt to force the bridge at Jerusalem. We do not know their strength, but think that they are now effectually hemmed in, and must all perish within a few days. Dr. Scott left Belfield yesterday, with a strong party of horse, and the determination of pursuing them until every man of them was taken or destroyed.
Richmond Constitutional Whig, Richmond, Virginia, August 29th, 1831. Extract of a letter from the senior editor, dated Jerusalem, Southampton Courthouse. Thursday evening, August 25th, 1831. The Richmond troop arrived here this morning a little after 9 o'clock, after a rapid, hot, and most fatiguing march from Richmond. On the road, we met 1,000 different reports, no 2 agreeing and leaving it impossible to make a plausible guess at the truth. On the route from Petersburg, we found the whole country thoroughly alarmed, every man armed, the dwellings all deserted by the white inhabitants, and the farms most generally left in possession of the blacks. On our arrival at this village, we found Commodore Elliott and Colonel Worth with 250 U States troops from the neighborhood of Old Point and a considerable militia force. A troop of horse from Norfolk and one from Prince George have since arrived. Jerusalem was never so crowded from its foundation, for besides the considerable military force assembled here, the ladies from the adjacent country, to the number of 300 or 400, have sought refuge from the appalling dangers by which they were surrounded. Here, for the first time, we learnt the extent of the insurrection and the mischief perpetrated. Rumor had infinitely exaggerated the first, swelling the numbers of the Negroes to 1,000 or 1,200 men and representing its ramifications as embracing several of the adjacent counties. particularly Isle of Wight and Greensville, but it was hardly in the power of rumor itself to exaggerate the atrocities which have been perpetrated by the insurgents. Whole families, father, mother, daughters, sons, sucking babes, and school children butchered, thrown into heaps, and left to be devoured by hogs and dogs or to putrefy on the spot. At Mr. Levi Waller's, his wife and 10 children were murdered and piled in one bleeding heap on his floor. Waller himself was absent at the moment, but approaching while the dreadful scene was acting, was pursued and escaped into a swamp with much difficulty. One small child in the house at the time escaped by concealing herself in the fireplace, witnessing from the place of her concealment the slaughter of the family and her elder sisters among them. Another child was cruelly wounded and left for dead, and probably will not survive. All these children were not Mr. Waller's. A school was kept near the house at which, and between which and his house, the ruthless villains murdered several of the helpless children. Many other horrors have been perpetrated. The killed, as far as ascertained, amount to 62. I send a list believed to be correct, as far as it goes. There are probably others not yet known hereafter to be added. A large proportion of these were women and children. It is not believed that any outrages were offered to the females. How or with whom the insurrection originated is not certainly known. The prevalent belief is that on Sunday week last at Barnes Church in the neighborhood of the Cross Keys, the Negroes who were observed to be disorderly took offense at something, yet it is not known what, that the plan of the insurrection was then and there conceived, matured in the course of the week following, and carried into execution on Sunday night, the 21st of August. The atrocities commenced at Mr. Travis's. A Negro called Captain Moore, and who it is added is a preacher, is the reputed leader. On Monday, most of the murders were perpetrated. It is said that none have been committed since that day. The numbers engaged are not supposed to have exceeded 60. One account says 100, another not so many as 40. 12 armed and resolute men were certainly competent to have quelled them at any time. But taken by surprise with such horrors before their eyes, and trembling for their wives and children, the men most naturally only thought in the first place of providing a refuge for those dependent upon them. Since this has been effected, the citizens have acted with vigor. Various parties have scoured the country, and a number of the insurgents, differently reported, have been killed or taken. There are 13 prisoners now at this place, one or more of them severely wounded. The principal of them, a man aged about 21 called Marmaduke, who might have been a hero, judging from the magnanimity with which he bears his sufferings. He is said to be an atrocious offender and the murderer of Miss Vaughan, celebrated for her beauty. The preacher captain has not been taken. At the Cross Keys, summary justice in the form of decapitation has been executed on one or more prisoners. The people are naturally enough wound up to a high pitch of rage, and precaution is even necessary to protect the lives of the captives. Scouring parties are out, and the insurrection may be considered as already suppressed. Jerusalem, Saturday, 27th. Since writing the accompanying letter, which was expected to have been sent off immediately, other prisoners have been taken and in one or two instances put to death forthwith by the enraged inhabitants. Some of these scenes are hardly inferior in barbarity to the atrocities of the insurgents, and it is to be feared that a spirit of vindictive ferocity has been excited, which may be productive of farther outrage and prove discreditable to the country. Since Monday, the insurgent Negroes have committed no aggression, but have been dodging about in the swamps in parties of 3 and 4. They are hunted by the local militia with great implacability and must all eventually be slain or made captive. All the mischief was done between Sunday morning and Monday noon. In this time, the rebels traversed a country of near 20 miles extent, murdering every white indiscriminately and wrecking the furniture. They set fire to no houses and, as far as is known, committed no outrage on any white female. What the ulterior object was is unknown. The more intelligent opinion is that they had none, though some of them say it was to get to Norfolk, seize a ship, and go to Africa. My own impression is that they acted under the influence of their leader, Nat, a preacher and a prophet among them, that even he had no ulterior purpose, but was stimulated exclusively by fanatical revenge, and perhaps misled by some hallucination of his imagined spirit of prophecy. Committing the first murder, finding themselves already beyond the reach of pardon, drunk and desperate, they proceeded in blind fury to murder and destroy all before them. It will be long before the people of this country can get over the horrors of the late scenes or feel safe in their homes. Many will probably migrate. It is an aggravation of the crimes perpetrated that the owners of the slaves in this country are distinguished for lenity and humanity. Cotton and corn are the staples here, and the labor of attending to these is trifling compared with what is necessary in other parts of the state. A list of persons killed in the insurrection, which commenced the 21st of August, 1831 in Southampton County. Joseph Travis, his wife and 3 children, 5. Mrs. Turner, Hartwell Peebles, the overseer, and Mrs. Newman, 3. Mrs. Reese and son William and Barham, 3. Tragan Doyle, wife and child, 3. Henry Bryant, wife, child, and wife's mother, 4. Mrs. Catherine Whitehead, son Richard, 4 daughters and grandchild, 7. Salathiel Francis, 1. Overseer of Nathaniel Francis, and 2 children, 3. Tom Barrow and George Vaughn, 2. Mrs. Levi Waller and 10 children, probably not all hers, husband and 1 child, escaped. The child, by getting up the chimney, 11. William Williams, his wife and 2 boys, 4. Jacob William, 3 children, and Edwin Drury, 5. Mrs. Caswell Worrell and child, 2. Mrs. Rebecca Vaughn, daughter Anna Liza, and son Arthur, 3. Mrs. John Williams and child, 2. Mrs. Jonder Vaughn and 3 children, 4. Total 62.
The Richmond Inquirer, Richmond, Virginia, August 30th, 1831. The banditti. So much curiosity has been excited in the state, and so much exaggeration will go abroad, that we have determined to devote a great portion of this day's paper to the strange events in the county of Southampton. What strikes us as the most remarkable thing in this matter is the horrible ferocity of these monsters. They remind one of a parcel of bloodthirsty wolves rushing down from the Alps, or rather like a former incursion of the Indians upon the white settlements. Nothing is spared. Neither age nor sex is respected. The helplessness of women and children pleads in vain for mercy. The danger is thought to be over, but prudence still demands precaution. The lower country should be on the alert. The case of Nat Turner warns us. No black man ought to be permitted to turn a preacher through the country. The law must be enforced, or the tragedy of Southampton appeals to us in vain. A fanatic preacher by the name of Nat Turner, General Nat Turner, who had been taught to read and write, and permitted to go about preaching in the country, was at the bottom of this infernal brigandage. He was artful, impudent, and vindictive, without any cause or provocation that could be assigned. He was the slave of Mr. Travis. He and another slave of Mr. Travis, a young fellow by the name of Moore, were 2 of the leaders. 3 or 4 others were first concerned and most active. They had 15 others join them, and by importunity or threats they prevailed upon about 20 others to cooperate in the scheme of massacre. We cannot say how long they were organizing themselves, but they turned out on last Monday early, the 22nd, upon their nefarious expedition. They were mounted to the number of 40 or 50, and with knives and axes knocking on the head or cutting the throats of their victims. They had few firearms among them, and scarcely one, if one, was fit for use. But as they went from house to house, they drank ardent spirits, and it is supposed that in consequence of their being intoxicated, or from mere fatigue, they paused in their murderous career about 12 o'clock on Monday.
Richmond Constitutional Whig, Richmond, Virginia, September 3rd, 1831. Southampton affair. We have been astonished since our return from Southampton, whether we went with Captain Harrison's troop of horse, in reading over the mass of exchange papers accumulated in our absence, to see the number of false, absurd, and idle rumors circulated by the press touching the insurrection in that country. Editors seem to have applied themselves to the task of alarming the public mind as much as possible by persuading the slaves to entertain a high opinion of their strength and consequences. While truth is always the best policy and best remedy, the exaggerations to which we have alluded are calculated to give the slaves false conceptions of their numbers and capacity by exhibiting the terror and confusion of the whites, and to induce them to think that practicable which they see is so much feared by their superiors. We have little to say of the Southampton tragedy beyond what is already known. The origin of the conspiracy, the prime agents, its extent and ultimate direction is matter of conjecture. The universal opinion in that part of the country is that Nat, a slave, a preacher, and a pretended prophet, was the first illegible, the actual leader and the most remorseless of the executioners. According to the evidence of a Negro boy whom they carried along to hold their horses, Nat commenced the scene of murder at the first house, Travis, with his own hand. Having called upon two others to make good their valiant boasting, so often repeated of what they would do, and these shrinking from the requisition, Nat proceeded to dispatch one of the family with his own hand, animated by the example and exhortations of their leader, having a taste of blood and convinced that they had now gone too far to recede. His followers dismissed their doubts and became as ferocious as their leader wished them. To follow the illegible capture of Travis's house early that day, to their dispersion at Parker's cornfield early in the afternoon, when they had traversed near 20 miles, murdered 63 whites, and approached within 3 or 4 miles of the village of Jerusalem. The immediate object of their movement to describe the scenes at each house, the circumstances of the murders, the hairbreadth escapes of the few who were lucky enough to escape, would prove as interesting as heart-rendering. Many of the details have reached us, but not in so authentic a shape as to justify their publication, nor have we the time or space. Let a few suffice. Of the event at Dr. Blount's, we had a narrative from the gallant old gentleman himself, and his son, a lad about 15, distinguished from his gallantry and modesty, and whom we take leave to recommend to Jenner Jackson for warrant in the Navy or West Point. The doctor had received information of the insurrection, and that his house would be attacked a short time before the attack was made. Crippled with the gout and indisposed to leave, he decided to defend his home. His force was his son, overseer, and 3 other white men. Luckily, there were 6 guns and plenty of powder and shot in the house. These were barely loaded, his force posted, and the insurrections given when the Negroes from 15 to 30 strong rode up about daybreak. The doctor's orders were that each man should be particular in his aim and should fire one at a time. He himself reserved 1 gun, resolved if the house was forced to sell his life as dearly as he could. The remaining 5 fired in succession upon the assailants at the distance of 15 or 20 steps. The blacks, upon the 5th fire, retreated, leaving 1 killed, we believe, and 1 wounded, a fellow named Hark, and were pursued by the doctor's Negroes with shouts and execrations. Had the shot been larger, more execution doubtless would have been done. Mrs. Vaughan's was among the last houses attacked. A venerable Negro woman described the scene which she had witnessed with great emphasis. It was near noon, and her mistress was making some preparation in the porch for dinner, when happening to look towards the road, she discerned a dust and wondered what it could mean. In a second, the Negroes, mounted and armed, rushed into view, and making an exclamation indicative of her horror and agony, Mrs. Vaughan ran into the house. The Negroes dismounted and ran around the house, pointing their guns at the doors and windows. Mrs. Vaughan appeared at a window and begged for her life, inviting them to take everything she had. The prayer was answered by one of them firing at her, which was followed by another and a fatal shot. In the meantime, Miss Vaughan, who was upstairs and unappraised of the terrible advent until she heard the noise of the attack, rushed down and, begging for her life, was shot as she ran a few steps from the door. A son of Mrs. Vaughan, about 15, was at the still house when, hearing a gun and conjecturing, it is supposed, that his brother had come from Jerusalem, approached the house and was shot as he got over the fence. It is difficult for the imagination to conceive a situation so truly and horribly awful as that in which these unfortunate ladies were placed, alone, unprotected, and unconscious of danger, to find themselves without a moment's notice for escape or defense in the power of a band of ruffians from whom instant death was the least they could expect. In a most lively and picturesque manner did the old negress describe the horrors of the scene, the blacks riding up with imprecations, the looks of her mistress, white as a sheet, her prayers for life, and the actions of the scoundrels environing the house and pointing their guns at the doors and windows, ready to fire as occasion offered. When the work was done, they called for drink and food, and becoming nice, damned the brandy as vile stuff. The scene at Vaughan's may suffice to give an idea of what was done at the other houses. A bloodier and more accursed tragedy was never acted even by the agency of the tomahawk and scalping knife. Interesting details will no doubt be evolved in the progress of the trials and made known to the public. For our own part, we still believe there was none, and if he be the intelligent man represented, we are incapable of conceiving the arguments by which he persuaded his own mind of the feasibility of his attempt, or how it could possibly end but in certain destruction. We therefore incline to the belief that he acted upon no higher principle than the impulse of revenge against the whites as the enslavers of himself and his race, that being a fanatic he possibly persuaded himself that heaven would interfere, and that he may have convinced himself, as he certainly did his deluded followers to some extent, that the appearance of the sun some weeks ago prognosticated something favorable to their cause. We are inclined to think that the solar phenomenon exercised considerable influence in promoting the insurrection, calculated as it was to impress the imaginations of the ignorant. Such we believe to be a summary outline of the Southampton insurrection. That insurrection reads some salutary lessons. To the whites, the propriety of incessant vigilance; to the blacks, the madness of all attempts such as that in Southampton. A few lives they may indeed sacrifice, but possession of the country, even for a week, is the most chimerical of notions. We assert confidently that 20 armed whites would put to the root the whole Negro population of Southampton. And we repeat our persuasion that another insurrection will be followed by putting the whole race to the sword.
The National Gazette, Philadelphia, Monday, August 29th, 1831. Insurrection in Virginia. Extract of a letter from a gentleman to his friend in Baltimore, dated Richmond, August 23rd. An express reached the governor this morning, informing him that an insurrection had broken out in Southampton, and that, by the last accounts, there were 70 whites massacred and the militia retreating. Another express to Petersburg says that the blacks were continuing their destruction, that 300 militia were retreating in a body before 600 or 800 blacks. A shower of rain coming up as the militia were making an attack wet the powder so much that they were compelled to retreat, being armed only with shotguns. The Negroes are armed with muskets, scythes, axes. Our volunteers are marching to the scene of action. A troop of cavalry left at 4:00 p.m. The artillery with 4 field pieces started in the steamboat. Norfolk at 6 o'clock to land at Smithfield, Southampton County, lies 80 miles south of us, below Petersburg. From the Richmond Whig of Tuesday. Disagreeable rumors having reached this city of an insurrection of the slaves in Southampton County, with loss of life, in order to correct exaggeration, and at the same time to induce all salutary caution, we state the following particulars. An express from the Honorable James Tresvant states that an insurrection had broken out, that several families had been murdered, and that the Negroes were embodied, requiring a considerable military force to reduce them. The names and precise numbers of the families are not mentioned. A letter to the postmaster corroborates the intelligence. Prompt and efficient measures are being taken by the governor to call out a sufficient force to put down the insurrection and place Lower Virginia on its guard. Serious danger, of course, there is none. The deluded wretches have rushed on assured destruction. The Fayette artillery and the light dragoons that will leave here this evening for Southampton. The artillery go in a steamboat, and the troops by land. We are indebted to the kindness of our friend Lyford for the following extract of a letter from the editors of the Norfolk Herald, containing the particulars of a most murderous insurrection among the blacks of Southampton County, Virginia. Norfolk, 24th August, 1831. I have a horrible, a heart-rending tale to relate, and lest even its worst features might be distorted one by rumor and exaggeration, I have thought it proper to give you all in the worst information that has as yet reached us through the best sources of intelligence which the nature of the case will admit. From a gentleman arrived here yesterday, express Suffolk, with intelligence from the upper part of Southampton County, stating that a band of insurgent slaves, some of them believed to be runaways from the neighboring swamps, had turned out on Sunday night last and murdered several whole families, amounting to 40 or 50 individuals. Some of the families were named, and among them was that of Mrs. Catherine Whitehead, sister of our worthy townsman, Dr. N.C. Whitehead, who with her son and 5 daughters fell a sacrifice to the savage ferocity of these demons in human shape. The insurrection was represented as one of the most alarming character, though it is believed to have originated only in a design to plunder, and not a view to a more important object, as Mrs. Whitehead, being a wealthy lady, was supposed to have had a large sum of money in her house. Unfortunately, a large number of effective male population was absent at camp meeting in Gates County, some miles off, a circumstance which gave a temporary security to the brigands in the perpetration of their butcheries, and the panic which they struck at the moment prevented the assembling of a force sufficient to check their career. As soon as this intelligence was received, our authorities met and decided on making an immediate application to call a house commanding at Fortress Monroe, who at 6 o'clock this morning embarked on board the steamboat Hampton, with 3 companies and a piece of artillery for Suffolk. These troops were reinforced in the roads by detachments from the U.S. ships Warren and Natchez, the whole amounting to nearly 300 men. Today, another express arrived from Suffolk, confirming the disastrous news of the preceding one, adding still more to the number of slain. The insurgents are believed to have from 100 to 150 mounted men, and about the same number on foot. They are armed with fowling pieces, clubs, ECT, and have had an encounter with a small number of the militia, who killed 6 and took 8 of them prisoners. They are said to be on their way to South Key, probably making their way to the Dismal Swamp, in which they will be able to remain for a short time in security. For my part, I have no fears of their doing much further mischief. There is very little disaffection in the slaves generally, and they cannot muster a force sufficient to effect any object of importance. The few who have thus rushed headlong into the arena will be shot down like crows or captured and made examples of. The militia are collecting in all the neighboring counties, and the utmost vigilance prevails. I subjoin a list of the victims of their savage vengeance. Mrs. Waters and family, 14, Mrs. Whitehead, 7, Mrs. Vanghan, 5, Jacob Williams, 5, Mr. Travis, 5, Wee. Reese, 4, Mr. Williams, 3, Mr. Baines, 2, Mrs. Turner, unknown, 10. Total, 58. Besides these, a private letter adds the families of Mr. Barrow, and Henry Bryant, numbers not mentioned. Muskets, pistols, swords, and ammunition have been forwarded to Suffolk today by Commander Warrington, at the request of our civil authorities, and a number of our citizens have accoutred and formed themselves as a troop of cavalry and set off to assist their fellow citizens in Southampton. I trust the next news you hear will be that all is quiet again. In haste, yours. Extract from another letter to the same gentleman, dated at Norfolk, 5 o'clock p.m. It is now 5 o'clock. Thompson's stage has just arrived. The above statement is confirmed, and in addition it is stated that 300 Negroes, well mounted and armed, and headed by 1 or 2 white men, is the amount of the insurgent force. Southampton is bounded by the counties of Isle of Wight on the north and Northampton in North Carolina on the South.
Daily National Intelligencer, Washington, D.C., Monday, November 7, 1831. General Nat. The reported capture of the bandit, Nat Turner, proves to be correct. The Petersburg Intelligencer of Friday last contains the following statement of the fact. It is with much gratification we inform the public that the sole contriver and leader of the late insurrection in Southampton, concerning whom such a hue and cry has been kept up for months, and so many false reports circulated, the murderer, Nat Turner, has at last been taken and safely lodged in prison. It appears that on Sunday morning last, Mr. Phipps, having his gun, and going over the lands of Mr. Francis, one of the first victims of the hellish crew, came to a place where a number of pines had been cut down, and perceiving a slight motion among them, cautiously approached, and when within a few yards, discovered the villain who had so long eluded pursuit, endeavoring to ensconce himself in a kind of care, the mouth of which was concealed with brush. Mr. Phipps raised his gun to fire, but Nat hailed him and offered to surrender. Mr. Phipps ordered him to give up his arms. Nat then threw away an old sword, which it seems was the only weapon he had. The prisoner, as his captor came up, submissively laid himself on the ground, and was then securely tied, not making the least resistance. Mr. Phipps took Nat to his own residence, where he kept him until Monday morning, and having apprised his neighbors of his success, a considerable party accompanied him and his prisoner to Jerusalem, where, after a brief examination, the culprit was committed to jail. Our informant, one of our own citizens, who happened to be in the county at the time, awards much praise to the people of Southampton for their forbearance on this occasion. He says that not the least personal violence was the most miserable objects he ever beheld, dejected, emaciated, and ragged. The poor wretch, we learn, admits all that has been alleged against him, says that he has at no time been 5 miles from the scene of his atrocities, and that he has frequently wished to give himself up, but could never summon sufficient resolution. Mr. Phipps, as the sole captor of Nat, is alone entitled to the several rewards amounting in the aggregate, as we understand, to about $100 offered by the Commonwealth and different gentlemen for his apprehension, and we are told that in this instance fortune has favored a very deserving individual to whom, in addition to the pleasure arising from the recollection of the deed, the money derived from it will not be unacceptable.
The Liberator, Boston, Massachusetts, September 3rd, 1831. The Insurrection. What we have long predicted, at the peril of being stigmatized as an alarmist and declaimer, has commenced its fulfillment. The first step of the earthquake, which is ultimately to shake down the fabric of oppression, leaving not one stone upon the other, has been made. The first drops of blood, which are but the prelude to a deluge from the gathering clouds, have fallen. Read the account of the insurrection in Virginia, and say whether our prophecy be not fulfilled. True, the rebellion is quelled. Those of the slaves who were not killed in combat have been secured, and the prison is crowded with victims destined for the gallows. You have seen, it is to be feared, but the beginning of sorrows. All the blood which has been shed will be acquired at your hands. At your hands alone? No, but at the hands of the people of New England and of all the free states. The crime of oppression is national. The South is only the agent in this guilty traffic. But remember, the same causes are at work which must inevitably produce the same effects, and when the contest shall have again begun, it must be a war of extermination. Ye accuse the pacific friends of emancipation of instigating the slaves to revolt. The slaves need no incentive at our hands. They will find in their stripes, in their emaciated bodies, in their ceaseless toil, in their ignorant minds, in your speeches and conversations, your celebrations, your pamphlets, your newspapers, voices in the air, sounds from across the ocean, invitations to resistance above, below, around them. What more do they need? For ourselves, we are horror-struck at the late tidings. We have exerted our utmost efforts to avert the calamity. We have warned our countrymen of the danger of persisting in their unrighteous conduct. We have preached to the slaves the pacific precepts of Jesus Christ. We have appealed to Christians, philanthropists, and patriots for their assistance to accomplish the great work of national redemption through the agency of moral power, of public opinion, of individual duty. How have we been received? We have been threatened, proscribed, vilified, and imprisoned. If we have been hitherto urgent and bold and denunciatory in our efforts, hereafter we shall grow vehement and active with the increase of danger. We shall cry in trumpet tones night and day, "Woe to this guilty land, unless she speedily repents of her evil doings." The blood of millions of her sons cries aloud for redress. Immediate emancipation can alone save her from the vengeance of heaven and cancel the debt of ages.
National Gazette and Literary Register, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, September 1st, 1831, from the Baltimore Chronicle. Negro Insurrection in Virginia. Office of the Norfolk Herald, August 29, 6 p.m., Southampton. Some of our citizens of the Cavalry Guard who left here last Wednesday have returned. They represent the disturbed section as entirely tranquil, the militia and patrols having scoured every foot of it, and apprehended every black going at large who submitted, and shot all who fled and could not be taken alive. A large number of prisoners have been taken, many of whom, however it may be, were unconnected with the outrages. The U.S. Marines and seamen under the command of Commander Elliott are on their return. The Marines of the Warren reached Smithfield on Saturday evening. We have just received letters from Winton and Murfreesboro, North Carolina, detailing some further particulars of these unpleasant transactions. Our friend in Winton says the number of victims is reduced to 55, many heretofore supposed to be murdered. From the Richmond Inquirer of Friday the 1st, postscript latest account, an express arrived last night, a little before 10 o'clock, with dispatches from Petersburg for the governor. One of the letters is from Captain D.H. Branch. He informs that a letter had been received from Jerusalem, written on Wednesday. The writer is said to be an intelligent and respectable man. He states that he had seen the bodies of all or most of the whites who had been murdered in that neighborhood, amounting to about 40, most of them, women and children. That a skirmish had taken place on Tuesday between the whites and the blacks in that quarter, amounting to about 40, in which no loss was sustained by the whites, and several of the blacks killed, and 6 or 8 of them taken prisoners and thrown into jail. Captain B understands that the blacks are in 2 or 3 detachments, that they have perpetrated in all about 50 murders, that they have lost a considerable part of their force, that their spirits are broken, that their object seems now to be to skulk, and that they have lost all further intention of committing further depredations. He is of the opinion, from what he understands, that no more troops will be required to repress them, there being a sufficient number to achieve that object. The express who brought the letters from Petersburg understands that the Richmond Dragoons arrived in Southampton on Wednesday night. The story of the leader being shot down near Jerusalem is said to be contradicted. It is suggested that he is a Negro from North Carolina, and his name has been quoted, we know not on what authority, to be that of Nathaniel Turner. It is supposed that most of these marauders and murderers were runaway Negroes who had broken in upon the white population for robbery and other mischief. There is no appearance of concert among the slaves, nothing that can deserve the name of insurrection, which it was originally denominated. There is some story of a few white faces being seen, or supposed to be seen, among them. No particular account has been received of the detachment near Belfield, though there were rumors of some of them having been cut or shot down. The number of the banditti has been probably much magnified, if it be true that only 40 were engaged in the skirmish near Jerusalem. There is no doubt that any further danger from them is by this time over, and they will dearly rue the day when they ever dared to break in upon the peace of the country, and to shed the blood of anyone, particularly the women and children.
Well, that's our show for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in, and if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe.